Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, we take an interesting look back at the great Galveston hurricane of 1900 and how it changed the city and the state of Texas forever. Plus, we reveal the mistakes that were made in forecasting this destructive and deadly storm and how it helped the way we forecast today. And we have the top 3 costliest hurricanes ever to hit the United States. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. For 124 years, the Great Galveston Hurricane, known to Texans as the Great Storm of 1900 or the 1900 Storm, has remained the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. More than 6,000 people perished as a Category 4 hurricane swept through Galveston that tragic September day, leaving the city all but destroyed. Did poor communication and ill-fated forecasting doom the thriving, prosperous port on the Gulf of Mexico? The 1900 storm changed Galveston forever and is just one of the amazing stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining me now with more on America's worst hurricane and how it boosted Houston is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Why was this event so important, and what did it do to Galveston when it made landfall on that day in 1900?
Well, it was catastrophic, obviously. It was unexpected. The people were not forewarned. It was a Category 4 storm, and devastating in terms of loss of life. 6,000 to 12,000 or more people were killed. Mm-hmm. And it completely changed the economy of southeast Texas because it was the end of Galveston as one of the big centers of commerce and riches and so on, which then shifted to Houston.
Galveston was one of the biggest cities in Texas, and in 1900, far bigger than Houston and other cities.
Yes.
Could you expand on that just a little bit, how big the city was and how important it was?
Well, it was the 4th largest city in Texas. It was on the coast, so it was a place that people that had wealth would go because it was a place to go, particularly in the wintertime to cool off. So it had more millionaires than any other city in Texas. It was a thriving place, a port. Mm-hmm. And all that was changed on that fateful day in September.
How devastating was it to the city of Galveston?
Well, just think, the highest point on the island where Galveston is 8.7 feet. The water, the storm surge, got to 15 feet.
Wow.
So it washed over the entire city.
It came in, and the fact that it tracked right across the Gulf of Mexico gave it a lot more time to strengthen. And Category 4 hurricane, that's at least maximum sustained winds of 131 miles per hour, hitting the city of Galveston, and no one knew that it was coming.
There was a forecaster in Galveston who was aware, or he thought it was anyway. He had to follow the official warnings from the headquarters, but it got to a point he didn't believe it. So even 36 to 48 hours ahead, he had inkling from the clouds and what was happening that the forecast was going to be wrong. They weren't very good in those days, and he was worried. So he actually went to the beach and told people to get off the beach. Well, that wasn't enough, of course, because this was a tremendous disaster coming, and they had no idea what the intensity was. And unfortunately, after the storm, even his wife was killed. Yeah. So many people, there was no place to really hide. It was a question of chance, really, who survived that storm.
And how does the Great Galveston Hurricane in 1900 compare with, let's say, other storms that have made landfall in the United States?
Well, we don't know exactly what the intensity was when it hit, but it probably, since it's a barrier island, really, you're in the Gulf, and it probably was a Category 4 or close to it. So even when there have been 40 Category 5s in history that we know about, many of them didn't hit land. And when they hit land, they were already weakened. So it was about as powerful as they get. There was the famous Florida Keys hurricane in 1935. Right. There was a Category 5, and the lowest barometric pressure measured in the United States, that record I think still stands, 26.35 inches. But That was probably the worst, but this was one of the worst, certainly.
In your book, you describe a recent book called Hurricanes Furious Sky by Eric Dolan. He suspected that the damage from all hurricanes in the U.S. history exceeds $1 trillion. You think that's a little underdone?
I do. When you really think of all the flooding, the records we didn't have, and so on and so forth, it's probably in the trillions. It could be as much as 20 to 25. If it all happened in 1 year, if all the damage from hurricanes that we've experienced in our history occurred in 1 year, it would probably represent 20 to 25% of the entire GDP of the country. So hurricanes have caused a lot of heartache and a lot of damage and economic loss.
Yeah, just a fascinating and a heartbreaking story in Galveston, the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. All right, thanks, Dr. Joe. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Joining us now for a historical look at this devastating hurricane is Dwayne Jones. He's the Executive Director of Galveston Historical Foundation. Thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Let's talk about Galveston back in 1900. What was Galveston like, and what did it compare to other Texas cities?
So Galveston grew dramatically in the late 19th century from about 1870 to 1900. It was the largest city in Texas until 1890, and Dallas had just barely exceeded it in the population of 1890. But it was just a little bit less than 38,000 in actual residents. A lot of buildings, of course. It was the largest financial center in Texas. It was a port, had been a port for most of the 19th century, a very active one. And it was also the cultural and arts center for the state of Texas as well.
How did the hurricane affect Galveston's future right after the disaster? And why wasn't the city rebuilt right away?
So, I think it's hard for people to think about the trauma that that existed. People were not able to recover quickly. They were dealing with the death of family members and friends, and they were piling up bodies, and they were burning them or destroying them, animals and rubble and various other things. All of that is very hard to emotionally face and deal with, and certainly took a time for them to manage that. And it was a time before they could actually get people into the island to help deal with some of these things.
What impact did this hurricane have on a city up the road called Houston?
So Houston was a smaller city than Galveston at that time, but the port of Houston and the port of Galveston had both been growing. And the Galveston Bay had been dredged. The Deep Water Harbor project that had been funded by Congress was being developed at the time. So for the first time, ocean-going vessels were able to access the port of Houston. And under that, there became an interest and became the facilities in order to support a growing economy in Houston. The 1900 storm solidified the question of why do we build and why do we rebuild and why do we maintain this island community that will always be vulnerable to storms. Galveston still maintained most of its old families, most of its wealth, most of its importance in many respects of finance and commerce. But Houston pretty soon began to overtake that and, of course, became the very large city that we know as today.
Now, is Galveston prepared for a major hurricane now?
So 500 city blocks were elevated behind a 17-foot seawall that was built along the southern part of the island. And that seawall slopes down to the bay. And so all those properties that were in that slope were lifted up to be on a new level. The seawall was not first conceived after this hurricane. It was already proposed before the hurricane, but folks like Isaac Klein, the weatherman, had said there was no need to worry about Galveston ever having a large storm because the Gulf of Mexico was too shallow for a storm. Right. He was obviously wrong. The storm of 1915, it made a difference. It reduced property damage and reduced life. But today, the storms, anybody who deals with storms knows that they have a different complexion sometimes, and every storm is different.
Right.
And Hurricane Ike in 2008, it was a water event coming behind the seawall, not a wind event coming over the seawall. So protection in some ways is a false protection of the seawall, but it is a stronger, convincing argument than having no seawall.
Dwayne Jones, Executive Director of Galveston Historical Foundation, thank you for joining us.
Very good. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Coming up, we revealed the top 3 costliest hurricanes ever that hit the United States. But next, we take an interesting look at the mistakes that were made in forecasting the Great Galveston Hurricane and how it helped the way we forecast today. Welcome back. We're continuing our fascinating discussion on the Galveston hurricane. Still today, the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. We're now taking a unique look at how the mistakes that were made changed forecasting and the city of Galveston forever. Back with me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Why didn't people evacuate before the hurricane hit?
They had no warning.
Yeah.
There was no warning, and people were taken by surprise, and it was a devastating hurricane, a Category 4, hitting a place that was very exposed. The elevation of the island, the highest point, less than 9 feet. The storm surge 15 feet, tremendous winds. I mean, it wreaked havoc and destroyed virtually every building on the island and drowned many of the inhabitants. It was just a thorough disaster that just caught everybody by surprise. Not everybody, but the people had no warning.
There was a conflict between the Cuban meteorologist and the U.S. Weather Bureau. Let's get into that because that's very interesting.
It is. The Cuban meteorologists had a lot of experience in forecasting hurricanes. The island buffeted by hurricanes, and that was their expertise. They tried to warn the meteorologists at what was the U.S. Weather Bureau at the time, and they just didn't believe it. The American forecasters were convinced that the storm was going to hit Florida and go up the East Coast, and they just said storms don't move that way. Well, of course, we know they do, but they were arrogant. It's interesting because today AccuWeather sometimes disagrees with and forecasts better the track of hurricanes, and sometimes we get a reaction like that too, unfortunately. But in this case, it was really unfortunate, that arrogance of not wanting to consider the expertise from Cuba would have allowed warnings and probably saved some lives.
So was it really just arrogance that the U.S. Weather Bureau didn't listen to the Cuban meteorologists? Because they, from what I understand, the Cuban meteorologists were very frustrated because they felt pretty strongly that this was going into the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, getting it all secondhand, but yeah, that's true. They were. It seems like there was arrogance on the part of. I mean, they could have. Just think about it. Communicate. There's a threat, and so on. They didn't do any of that. So a lot of it's with severe weather is communications, which AccuWeather specializes in, letting people know what the risk is and how much of a risk, and have that change with time. In this case, there was no hint of a hurricane coming, and so people were completely taken by surprise. They had no preparations. The only exception is there is reports that the weatherman, the government weather forecaster in Galveston did think a day or two before, hey, the clouds, I think the forecast might be wrong. And so he went to the beach to warn people to get off the beach. But clearly, even then, he had no idea the strength of the storm that was coming.
Yeah, that was as it climbed. Now, the wind often gets all the attention with hurricanes, but back then, just like what we see today, the wind does damage, but the biggest killer is storm surge.
Overall, when you look at all the damage and all the loss of life and so on, and try to rank the 3 biggest causes of death and destruction, from hurricanes. It's the storm surge on the coast that does the most damage, the most fatalities. It's the inland flooding from torrential rain, and in third place is the wind, even though the wind gets all the attention. And the winds tend to be very ferocious over the water, but as the storm comes inland, obviously there can be tremendous winds on the coast, but they quickly weaken as the storm moves inland.
And of course, the question becomes, why was it not named?
Well, they didn't start naming hurricanes till 1953.
Yeah. We think of the United States as a place for certainly hurricanes. Are there other parts of the world that are especially vulnerable to hurricane fatalities?
Well, first in the United States, clearly the Gulf Coast and to Florida and up the East Coast, but just about every state from Texas to Maine has been hit by hurricanes and suffered disasters, and even inland from flooding and heavy rain, as far as Tennessee and some inland states have been affected. And of course, we saw last year that California was affected by a Pacific hurricane. But yeah, there are about 80 to 90 hurricanes around the world. They're called typhoons in the Pacific off the west coast. Of course, they're called hurricanes in the Bay of Bengal are called cyclones. But when you add them all up, in a year's time, there are about 80 to 90. The hurricanes in Australia, there are a lot of different places, but the worst ones in terms of death toll have been in the Bay of Bengal that have affected India and Bangladesh. There have been 7 or 8 storms that have killed over 150,000 people at one time, one hurricane. And there's one in particular we know about, 1970, that may have killed 500,000 people. One storm. That's just incredible.
Thanks, Dr. Joel.
You're very welcome.
Up next, billion-dollar disasters. We reveal the top 3 costliest hurricanes to ever hit the United States. It might surprise you on which ones made the list. We're back after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. We're revealing the 3 costliest hurricanes ever to hit the United States. But first, did you know China is the only country to be impacted by more hurricanes than the U.S.? While the southwestern U.S. is affected by eastern Pacific hurricanes, it's the Atlantic Basin causing most impacts. In fact, since 1851, Atlantic hurricanes have produced hurricane-force winds in every state along the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico, including Pennsylvania. Of course, Florida leads the charge, having been affected by more hurricanes than any other state. Now let's take a look at our 3 costliest hurricanes to hit the United States. In October of 2012, Sandy began in the Caribbean and tracked up the East Coast. Sandy made landfall in New Jersey and unleashed hurricane-force winds and catastrophic storm surge flooding to New York and Connecticut. The monster storm caused 147 fatalities, and AccuWeather determined the economic cost at $210 billion. Next, Hurricane Harvey. In August of 2017, this Category 4 hurricane slammed into the Gulf Coast. It stalled over Texas, delivering from 40 to 60 inches of rain in the Houston area. This led to catastrophic flooding, more than 100 deaths, and $230 billion in damage. In August of 2005, Katrina first made landfall in Florida, regained strength in the warm Gulf waters, making landfall in Louisiana as a Category 3 hurricane. With powerful winds and storm surge, the levees in New Orleans failed, leaving about 80% of the city underwater. Katrina caused more than 1,800 fatalities and, according to AccuWeather, $320 billion in damage. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers, for joining us today, and a big thanks to all of you for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time.